So before I begin today, I just want to remind you that I have started a new consulting practice, both in person and virtually. Please go to dramynovatt.com for all the information you need to learn about this new work. So I have been so fortunate. Here on GynoCurious, I've had the pleasure of speaking with an array of guests who have shared both their personal and professional perspectives on healing. Whether a breast surgeon, an acupuncturist, a nutritionist, or a personal trainer, all these folks have talked about their journeys, how they help other women heal, or about their own personal experiences with ill health, and ways they improve their well-being and vitality. I've tried to share with you many points of view since I truly believe that there are so many ways to heal and that allopathy is only one way and that many of us have to combine modalities in order to optimize our health. I've also shared with you my concerns about our current medical system and ask that you as a listener appreciate there are real problems with medicine in the U.S. today. We are a sicker group of people than ever before, despite the number of medications we take and the money spent on our healthcare system. Welcome to GynoCurious. I am your host and creator, Dr. Amy Novatt. From both sides of the speculum, we're here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please follow, share. Let us know what you think about the show by writing us to comments@radiofreerhinecliffe.org. And, anything you want me to talk about, let me know. I'm glad to entertain it and investigate it with you. So my guest today is Pilar Gerasimo. Pilar is an award-winning health journalist, pioneering social explorer, and author of The Healthy Deviant, a rule breaker's guide to being healthy in an unhealthy world. She has a podcast, The Living Experiment, and is the founding editor of Experience Life, an award-winning national print magazine that reaches more than 3 million people nationwide. She also teaches online courses through her digital learning platform, Healthy Deviant Academy. She is a guest lecturer at universities and a workshop leader at retreat centers across the globe. I am so grateful to have her on my show today. Welcome, Pilar.
Thank you so much, Amy. It is such a pleasure being here with you. What a delight.
And please remind me, where am I seeing you at? What state are you in?
I'm in the beautiful state of Wisconsin. I'm about an hour east of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and this is a communal, multi-generational organic farm. My mom started with her best friend in 1970, kind of a back-to-the-land farm, and I've lived a lot of other places, but I've always come back here. So today I work and live here from this farm, and it is a wonderful, beautiful place to be.
What a great tableau for your work. I love that.
Yeah, it is. And it really is, my book, The Healthy Deviant, talks about the importance of doing things differently than most people do them. That to be a healthy person in an unhealthy world, you have to deviate from social norms and expectations. And living on a farm in Wisconsin as a broadcaster and a journalist, as an author and a speaker, as someone in the health and fitness industry is quite unusual in and of itself, that most of the folks that I know in this business live on the coasts. New York, LA, San Francisco, wherever, San Diego. And I just, a little outlier here in the Midwest.
I like that. So I want to start with talking about your book, because one of the things that really struck me was kind of on it might have been page 3. It was your dedication. And this is what it said. It said, for Dad, who taught us to ask, why do we live the way we do? And for Mom, who taught us to ask, how could we live more the way we'd like to? Can you speak about this dedication and why it felt so relevant to your book and your work?
Oh, that is such a lovely question. And Amy, nobody has ever asked me that question before, but it's a really elemental, important foundational question. So my father was a sociologist, anthropologist, social psychologist. He was a professor at Lake Forest College, just outside of Chicago, and he attended the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD, and was colleagues with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was the positive psychologist, one of the founders of the positive psychology movement, and the creator of the concept flow, which is about optimal experience. So I grew up in a household with a lot of sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists types, and they were having conversations at the time I was born in 1967 about rethinking psychology and sociology and anthropology with a view to a then disrupted world. This was the 60s were very experimental. And the question at the time, the interest was more rather than why, how do you deal with sick, diseased mindsets, became how do you optimize personal development. It was about human potential, the human potential movement. So my father was extremely interested in how society influences people's life outcomes, life chances. He was an immigrant, a Greek immigrant, who was the first person in his family to go to college, much less get a PhD. And so he came from an outsider perspective and looked at the world through kind of outsider eyes. So he asked that question of like, why do we live the way we do? Well, how do the social norms and expectations and cultural manners affect us and influence our behavior? My mom, on the other hand, who was this college student at the time, not my father's student, but younger, had grown up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, not very far from here, actually, in Minnesota. And she was much more interested in a kind of utopian idealist set of perspectives. How could we live more the way we'd like to live? How could we be flourishing more, living in a more sustainable, gratifying way? And communal living was one of the answers that they came up with at that time. So she and a best friend started this kind of hippie commune, I would call it. I think a lot of people would see it that way, a back to the land communal farm. And really, we're trying to create the circumstances for health and happiness and a satisfying, meaningful life by building it from the ground up, literally building buildings out of recycled materials, raising us on organic homemade food. We didn't have a television. We didn't have electricity for a while. So I kind of grew up between the tension of those two questions. Why do we live the way we do? How might we live otherwise? And I think I chose a path different than either of my parents in some ways, but similar to both in some ways. And I've drawn from the lessons and the answers that they found for themselves, as well as the ones I had to find for myself. Like many kids, I needed to go away on my own quest and reject pretty much everything my parents taught me in order to find what was right for me, which turned out to be that a lot of what my parents had to say, even back in the 60s, was quite it was quite prescient and accurate. And I did kind of come round to, on the one hand, with my father's perspectives, realizing that deviance isn't necessarily a bad thing, that deviance can be a positive trait. Positive deviance is a term that's known in sociology and psychology. And then with my mom, I was like, I don't want to live on a hippie commune. My mom is so granola. Why won't you wear a bra? How come you don't wear lipstick? Can we just have normal clothes and food like everybody else? And then ended up, as I moved away and lived how I thought why I should live normally, I got sicker and less healthy and less happy, and ultimately had to go through my own journey of recovery from trying to be normal, losing my health and happiness and having to reclaim them my own way. So to me, if there are two people that I got the most wisdom from in my lifetime, it would be my parents. And my father's no longer with us, but my mom still lives here on the farm with us, and I still go to her from wisdom on a regular basis.
I like that, first of all, that there's this lineage that percolates through the family. And, we are so much the products of both nature and nurture, and certainly of our parents, if we're lucky to have, two parents in our lives. And the arc of kind of breaking apart from them, then coming close again, then breaking apart. And this is how we learn. But I just thought those questions were so, I kind of got this gut feeling when I read it. It was like, there couldn't be more simpler and yet complex questions. And it just I just really appreciated that dedication. So
I appreciate that you read it and were curious to ask.
Yeah.
It's funny because if I can say one more thing about that, it often think about the fact that even with the advantage of having parents who were outliers, who were experimenters, who were deviators, even so, it took a lot of work for me to get back to a position of deviating by my own choices, consciously choosing to deviate versus being in reaction, and then trying to do it the normal way, but realizing that there was at least an alternative. A lot of people are never presented with the alternative. They're never presented with other folks in their lives who challenge the status quo, who create a permissive environment to explore and experiment and find your own way. So, the thing I often remember, I walk, on the shoulders of these giants and all of the scholars and influencers that came before them, but having to navigate our unhealthy, unhappy world, it is such a conformity oriented world. There are so many incentives and pressures put upon people to adopt the default norms of our society. If I had not had the advantage of all of that previous experience, I think it would have been much, much more difficult. So I'm humbled by the fact that I still struggled with body image and weight issues. I still struggled with inflammatory chronic illness. I still struggled with feeling like I didn't belong or not knowing what I needed to do to feel good in my own skin. So depression and anxiety and all of the other problems that so many people struggle with now, I made my way through them and came out the other side in part thanks to my weird upbringing. But I realize that that is a privilege and an advantage that most people don't have. And it's part of the reason I wrote the book and included a bit of my story in part 2, which was the making of a healthy deviant. So people could kind of vicariously follow that journey with me and imagine what it might be like for them. In that part of the book, I encourage people to think about, where did you learn how to live? Where did you learn what to eat, how to look, what you should have, all of those expectations? I think it's really important background.
Thank you for honoring your journey, because I think so many folks who listen to us think, oh, for example, Dr. Novatt must always be healthy because she always talks about health and well-being. Well, no, like, for example, I just got over a really bad cold, and it's like, I've had cancer in my life. I've had, challenges like every other human being. And when people say to me, aren't you frustrated that you ate well and you exercised and you did all the right things, but you still got sick? And I was like, well, I had the body parts and I live in a world, and the world is complex and toxic, etc. So thank you for honoring that. So I want to talk about the healthy deviant. So you define a healthy deviant as, quote, one who willingly defies unhealthy norms and conventions in order to achieve a high level of vitality, resilience, and autonomy. And I guess the first question is, were people concerned about your using the word deviant?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yes, especially in the publishing world.
Yeah.
My agent initially, I went through a couple agents in part because the title was so triggering. The healthy deviant, of course, the term deviant has a very negative connotation. It sort of makes people think about criminals and lunatics and really bad people doing bad things. But because my father had taught me that a deviant, the objective definition of a deviant is simply someone who does not conform to their society's expectations and norms. And I learned that there were positive examples throughout history of people who deviated or who were deviants from their societal norms. And that included people like civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr., for example. It included a lot of spiritual leaders like Jesus Christ. Mother Teresa would be considered a deviant. Gandhi, deviant, like did not value material goods, did not follow the rules, was quite revolutionary in a lot of ways. So for me, the reclamation of that word deviant became very important. I was extremely attached to it, probably to my detriment when it came to trying to sell the book. I remember going to New York and visiting with Hay House and Sounds True and a lot of publishing houses that were intrigued by the proposal and liked my platform, but they were like, we won't even consider it really unless you're open to changing the title. And I'm like, I don't think I am, and I think that was sort of a humbling experience for me. I fought really hard for the cover of the book also, which has a smiling, winky kind of smiley face on it. Many reasons I wanted that. But I think my dedication to the term, while it may have triggered a lot of people into avoiding the book, my feeling is it would galvanize and attract the right audience of people who are ready to move beyond the conventional titles, which still today dominate the bookshelves. How to eat this, not that, get skinny, and thin thighs in 30 days was the single best-selling health and fitness title, like in history. And I was like, I am absolutely not going down that road. And part of it, I had so many friends who wrote really good books, but they got tagged with titles like the something something diet. And they would open by saying, this isn't a diet book. And I was like, well, that is really disconcerting to me because we're selling a set of lies, 1,000 Ways Till Sunday. And, from my bio, I started my journalistic career as a health and fitness editor. I started a magazine that was a whole person, whole life health and fitness magazine. And we broke all of the rules of publishing by not doing the six-pack abs covers, by not doing the thin thighs in 30 days types of headlines. But I, there too, on that project, got so many pieces of unhelpful advice of, you know what you need to do if you want to sell more magazines. And it was also the thing that had me when I was the top editor of health for Huffington Post for what I describe as about 5 hot minutes. It was the same problem. There's a very reliable formula to get people to buy the things that they think that they want or need or that interest them in the moment, but they tend to not actually help or move the needle when it comes to making significant change. To me, the mindset required to be healthy in an unhealthy world is by its very nature and a little bit of a revolutionary deviant sort of mindset. So I think the book does alienate certain people, and it probably has hurt my speaking career as well, because, large corporations may not like the idea of having someone on the stage who wrote a book called The Healthy Deviant. I think it also, pragmatically speaking, in this technological world, probably does not let my title get through a lot of like VPN filters or
Oh,
filters that, take out certain words that are considered sexual or what have you.
right.
So deviant, yeah, a little bit of a problem for some folks, but I still love it. And now I give out stickers to people that have healthy deviant on them. And, people put them on their
Oh, I
guitar
love it.
cases
I
and
love it.
phones. And yeah, it's
I
fun.
actually, for me, it was so strikingly authentic because, in fact,
Ah,
all that you're talking about greed, sales pitches, conforming to verbiage that is acceptable to the norm are those unhealthy norms that you'd speak to.
exactly.
I love the title, but I can appreciate from a professional, if you will, point of view, how triggering it is, which of course I think is terrific. But yeah, from the point of view from, I guess, all those things that you mentioned, it can be difficult. But let's talk about the unhealthy norms that you're speaking of vis-a-vis your title. What, if you were to give us just a short list, how would you describe
Yeah,
that to the audience?
sure. Well, the first set, I guess I divide them into maybe three different categories. The norms, on the one hand, are the norms we're most familiar with: sedentary lifestyles, processed food, convenience products, and then, all the normal toxic products we use every day on our bodies, in our homes. These are the kind of major brands that are owned by mega national companies. These are the products that are promoted to us, the passive entertainments, the way that we live, in our cars, getting to and from places, not encountering other people, a lot of solitary stuff, technological addictions of various kinds, the depressing, anxious producing media environment of news every day. So that's the stuff we know about. We don't sleep enough, la la la. We don't comply with enough light and dark cycles. So that's category one. Category two is actually the health and fitness pressures that we're under around expectations about body size and body image, the unachievable beauty ideals, the obsession with diets of one kind or another, really regimented workout programs or expectations that your body should look a certain way. What a fit body is in our minds is a very narrow scope. And then the kind of increasingly complex regimens around, your intermittent fasting combined with cold plunging, combined with mouth taping, combined with whatever. And none of those are bad things in and of themselves. But the idea that you are somehow supposed to live a life with a job and taking care of kids or parents and doing all the other things that we need to do in our modern society and keep up with this endlessly proliferating list of things tends to work against people. It also becomes very unachievable financially. We're buying more and more subscriptions for things, delivery services, technological gadgets, pieces of software, and then biohacking interventions, everything from cryogenic stuff to aesthetic treatments to plasma exchanges and very expensive supplemental regimens, functional medicine regimens. Again, nothing wrong with any of those individually, but for an individual trying to figure out what do I need to do to be healthy and happy, that's the second set of norms. We have to kind of help people navigate barriers that we need to navigate. Then there's a third set, which is sort of more in the realm of social compliance and expectations to the culture that holds up the idea of success as a human being, mostly having to do with wealth, power, fame, and keeping up with the Joneses in general, which does drive a kind of default mode of acquisition and the need, like a rapacious sort of hunger for the next thing and the next thing, often at the expense of social justice, the expense of environmental sustainability, at the expense of having a kind of beloved community idea where we are together in this together, trying to solve our problems together. It becomes one person for themselves against a difficult set of circumstances. And I think that just creates a toxic social environment that the norms of like, what does a successful life look like? And is it possible for me? I think challenging some of those norms, much like we did in the 60s and 70s, and we did many, many times before that in history, is important. I think people are becoming dissatisfied with the idea that I can do everything right and still not feel good in my own skin, still not feel safe on the street, still not feel like my life has meaning and value. And when I said before, I got to that point after I had gotten through college and gotten a good job and got a great house and a great car, and I thought I had everything going for me, waking up every day feeling kind of exhausted and incapable of keeping up with everything that was going on, and increasingly feeling out of touch with a life of greater meaning. And so those are the three kind of big categories of norms. And I think that that's part of what also makes the book a bit of a healthy deviant book. Very few health and fitness books are willing to go, the last chapter, that's part of my book is called Taking It to the Streets. And it's intended to kind of strike a little bit of a revolutionary note, because I do think we have to see our lives in a bigger context. Seeking health and fitness with a very mistaken notion that you do it by yourself, with yourself, on your own, I think that's a very losing battle and a very ungratifying one. Even if you win it, it doesn't look that great. I'm sure you know this too, Amy, because you hang out with people of a lot of different sorts. But when I moved often in the circles of extreme wealth and fame and power, which I did for a while in New York in particular, I would look around and say, I think I might be the happiest person at this party. I don't belong at this party at all, but I don't want to. This is not my thing, like I'm not seeing this look all that great from the inside either. So
Well, I
yeah,
love
thank you for
that.
asking again.
Yeah, well, what I like about I called it your trilogy, or your trifecta, the vitality, resilience, and autonomy. So instead of you're saying one who willingly defies unhealthy norms and conventions in order to achieve a high level of wellness,
Mm.
youth. I'm trying to think
Hmm.
of all the catchwords that are out there, right? All those
Oh
titles.
yeah.
Vitality, great. Resilience. Oh my gosh, it's so much a part of
Mm.
that rebellion and radicalization that we're kind of talking about, or you're talking about. And then autonomy. I mean, we're in a
Mm.
world right now where we're really trying to figure out how to maintain kind of all of those things, but particularly body autonomy, particularly
Yeah.
as women. So
Yeah.
I really, again, I really liked that those pursuits instead of the, typical list, if you will. Not that the lists of wellness and fitness and, those things, as you said, aren't worth achieving, but these are much more global ways of life, if you will,
Mm.
that
Yeah.
I do believe bring us a sense of groundedness, an understanding of health and illness that's much more accepting, and just this concept of resilience, of knowing that life is hard and that
Mm.
we're all just trying to understand what we need as individuals and in our community. And
Yeah.
that's lost. It's so often lost in so many other tomes around health.
I
So yeah.
agree. I agree. It's reminding me too, Amy, of a at the beginning of the book, in the first, well, few bits of the book, there's a little Healthy Deviance wanted poster.
Hmm.
And it's like a want ad, Healthy Deviance wanted. And I was inspired by, you may be familiar with the Shackleton's kind of infamous trip to the
Yes,
Antarctic, or the
yes.
ship that sunk. But when they were posting ads for sailors and people to be part of the team for that very kind of tragic adventure, it was like, people wanted for dangerous adventure, chances of success minimal, chances of safe return, iffy. I don't remember the exact term. So it's inspired by that. But when I wrote it, it starts out currently seeking bold, adventuresome, health motivated individuals to buck deadly trends and disrupt unhealthy social norms. Must be willing to defy convention, question authority and absurdity, sidestep conformity, and master a wide variety of healthy person skills, including the art of illuminating the best within them. It goes on to say no experience necessary, training provided, and so on. But the idea that the meaning of all of this is the biggest why behind it isn't to achieve 8% body fat, isn't to be able to run an ultramarathon, isn't to, live to be 175 years old. It's really to discover and illuminate what is uniquely special about you, what your gifts are, and then to be able and inspired and motivated to give them back to the world. So that every day when you wake up, you not only are feeling good, but you have a reason to keep doing the things that you need to do to stay healthy and happy. I mean, in a lot of organized religions, there's some version of this your body is a temple idea. I am not myself a very religious person, but I do find very attractive the notion that the reason we are in these meat suits, the reason that our souls or spirits are contained in these bodies take us through our lives and have us experience things and be able to, in an embodied way, participate and contribute to the world around us. And that is the single most important ingredient to a healthy, happy life, in my mind, is having a sense of purpose and meaning and gratification in the way that you live every single day. And so that illumination piece is, I think, really important.
Yeah.
And the autonomy is required for that, and the
Yeah.
vitality and the resilience.
Yeah. I want to remind those listening that you mentioned, and I'm going to read kind of a list, I won't read it all, but that part of what we're reacting to, what this book is about, is a reflection of how unhealthy this country is. And that, as I point out in other GynoCurious episodes, there's so much money being spent. There's so much attention to, historically, research and development in pharmaceuticals. And despite all of this, we are a very unhealthy community. Yeah. And so, as you write, today more than 50% of adults in this country are chronically ill. 2/3 of us are overweight or obese. Today's kids are the first generation in the U.S. history predicted to live less long than their parents. Huge numbers of them are chronically ill before they turn 18. 70% of U.S. adults regularly take one or more prescription drugs. And I'm just here to tell you, it is not uncommon for someone to come into my office and be on 10, 12 medications. And having been on them for years and no one ever asking, do you still need them? The top selling drugs are meds for blood pressure, cholesterol, depression, and heartburn. All lifestyle-related conditions that can be healed also through lifestyle changes. And 75 to 90% of the money we are spending on healthcare is being spent ineffectively on chronic lifestyle-related diseases. So, again, for those listening out there, we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. We're having this conversation in response to a world that is not well. And, I can't speak, I don't know enough about the data across the world. I do know the data here in the States, and you've traveled the world, so you may be able to educate us more. But there is something going on in this country that is not working. So the Healthy Deviant is not only timely, but is imperative for each and every one of us to think about, how do we break through? And I was reflecting, Pilar, when I was a kid, I was 18, and I was working for the summer before college, and I was working, not making much money, and the restaurant where I was a server had terrible food, but the only thing they had consistently was fresh salad stuff. And I became a vegetarian because I couldn't really afford to eat outside the restaurant. And the meat and other products in this restaurant were just unpalatable. And then I decided I was a vegetarian. I was a strident vegetarian. And it came out of necessity, but it also then became a form of rebellion. It really was, because people would say, how could you do this? It's too hard. Or my parents were pretty supportive, but at the same time, they were both omnivores. And, how do we make something for you when we're making, veal for the rest of the family? My friends, really couldn't understand it. This was at a time when it wasn't that popular. And so, again, as I read your work, I realized how personal our journeys are, and even these small acts of change. And trust me, in those days, I didn't necessarily do it because I thought it would be healthier for me. Even though I realized ultimately I was feeling better, it was really out of financial necessity and a response to the disgusting food I was serving. But but it did become eventually kind of this call to action. And
Yeah.
I felt so good about it, and yet it was truly a conflict. So I was reflecting how I was a healthy deviant before I knew
Yeah.
anything about it. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's so true that whether you are doing this because of a value-based decision about what you're eating or drinking or not drinking, whether it's about a deep commitment to honoring your personal like genome, if you have a celiac gene or you're gluten intolerant or dairy doesn't agree with you, anytime you attempt to deviate from our standard American diet and way of eating, there's a social cost to pay. The same thing is true, obviously, about not drinking, which is increasingly you're seeing more variation. People that are sober or California sober, people that are vegetarians or vegans, people that are omnivores but are very picky about the type of meat that they eat, people that are ketogenic for a while because they're on a regimen that a neurologist has put them on, but they don't plan to eat that way forever. And then people are like, oh, you went off your diet. So there's like a lot, everyone seems to have a judgment about what we should or shouldn't be doing, and we all face friction when we strive to follow our own hearts or bodies or minds or senses of value. And I think that is something, it's important to again put that into the context of a culture that is a primarily product driven food culture. It's a packaged food culture. It's a corporatized food culture. When people grow up in traditional, and I mean really traditional societies like nomadic hunter gatherer societies, there really isn't this set of problems on the front end to be solved. It's like there aren't immoral choices to be made when everything you get is hunted and gathered and eaten for your survival and well being. So you don't have to face that friction in that kind of society. You don't have to develop the skills of learning how to like count macros or, God forbid, calories or figure out the right ratios of all of these fibers and things. And I think that it's often underestimated the level of pressure and friction that creates for individual people to get through the most basic thing of just eating, which
Yeah.
is like sounds like a simple thing to do, but healthy eating looks really different for different people in our world, and it is at escalating levels of difficulty to do it anyway that is actually healthy. And it's so confusing to figure that out. Like impossible meat, good or bad? Depends on who you talk to. Do more animals die from, animal-driven agriculture or plant-driven agriculture, where there are a lot of animals out there in the field when things get mowed down? Who freaking knows? So everyone has a story. But we all, I think, are healthy deviants just by virtue of wanting to be healthy in an unhealthy world. And it's important to me that people understand a healthy deviant isn't somebody who does everything perfectly or subscribes to my particular way of eating or exercising. It's that willingness to defy the unhealthy conventions by virtue of your own choices and a willingness to notice what works or doesn't work for you, really, rather than listening to somebody else's story about what you quote unquote should or have to do to be a good, right person.
So let's get practical. How would you respond to someone who says, hey, I really do want to eat differently from my family, for example, but it's really hard? What might be some just practical strategies for someone who is feeling like she or he is ready to break the norm in some manner, even if it's a small step? How would you counsel them?
That's a great question. Well, my philosophy in Healthy Deviance, I talk a lot about nonconformist competencies. I think about these as the skill sets required to navigate an unhealthy culture and come through it intact, ideally getting better with each passing year. And the first nonconformist competency is called amplified awareness. And amplified awareness is that first, that willingness to notice what's going on inside you or around you that's triggering you for better or for worse. When you get hungry and eat crazy things, what's the circumstance in which that happens? What's motivating you to want to eat differently, for example? When you're eating well and feeling well, what is it that's happening there? How is that being defined by you? What patterns do you notice? From that amplified awareness, the next step is called preemptive repair. This assumes that just by virtue of living in an unhealthy culture, you have a lot of forces working against you, depleting your ability to make clear decisions, depleting your, what we call in this culture oftentimes willpower, not a term I love. I think of it as willingness to do the things that I'm wanting to do. But when we get depleted by living in a go, 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 always on, rushing, pressurized, distraction culture, a culture that has us feeling bad about ourselves, telling us what's wrong with us all the time, it makes it much, much harder for us to navigate the unhealthy environment. So preemptive repair is about getting ahead of the damage that's being done to us by living in this culture. So for my first advice would be for somebody who is wanting to eat differently, know that what you're going into is a bit of a battlefield. It's going to be more challenging than just knowing what you quote unquote should do. It's going to involve social friction. It's going to involve navigating difficult relationship conversations potentially. It's going to involve extra time and energy, potentially money for you to do that. So preemptive repair would be about preparing yourself for that, making sure you're getting more rest, making sure you're learning good skills around communication and negotiation, making sure you know how to prepare, practically speaking, to shop for yourself, to cook for yourself, or to know where you can access foods that are well prepared, that you can manage to do. It might be about navigating scheduling agreements and things like that. It's so much more than just the eating piece. And I think in this culture, we tend to jump right to the diet. We tend to jump right to the food product or the vitamin or the peptide or whatever it is. I think we miss the preparatory steps that help us get ready. And readiness to change, in fact, a lot of the psychology around behavior change, this conversation about readiness to change, including contemplation and preparation before you get to action. The third nonconformist
That's
competency
so
in Healthy Deviance,
anti-American of you.
I know, go for the goal, right? Get out there, get it done.
Sorry to interrupt.
It's very masculine.
It is.
No, it is. It's American and it's masculine.
Yeah.
A feminine approach is often much more like, let me step back and observe what goes on here. What's the real dynamic here? What is the pattern of eating in which I'm making this decision, right? What are the relationships I'm going to need to, how do I need to communicate and make collaborative arrangement, whatever it is. And that gets us to the third nonconformist competency, which is continuous growth and learning. That's about accepting you will need to develop new skills. You will need to develop new skills and new abilities and new capacities in order to pull this off. And they will be different skills year to year, month to month, season to season, relationship to relationship. I really have found that interest in continually learning and growing and sharpening your skills and believing that you can learn how to do anything that you don't already know how to learn. That's called a growth mindset. It's considered to be the most important factor in human success now, thanks to a lot of research by folks like Carol Dweck. And I think it becomes a bit of a it's like a flow experience. I opened talking a little bit about Csikszentmihalyi and the idea of flow. Flow experiences are challenging experiences. They're the ones where you set yourself to do something and you really do need to put the full force of your intelligence and effort behind it. And you can see you're making progress. And as you get stronger and better, you learn the next skill and the next skill and the next skill. In the culture we're living in too, it's really important to remember because our society is changing so quickly, because change is accelerating so quickly. And now with AI, it's almost impossible to predict what our society will look like 24 months from now. You also have to realize that the skills that worked for you last year may not work this year, or the skills that worked when you're 20 might not work when you're 40 or 50 or 60 or beyond. So I think it's a very curious, open-minded, humble, beginner's mind sort of approach to living that accepts that there will be challenges and you can rise to them, navigate around them if you choose. So it's hard to answer the question of just like, when someone wants to eat differently, how do you do that? There's a ton of worksheets, that could give you a list of things to do. I'd rather give people a framework for thinking about what is the motivation? What's the amplified awareness piece is like, why am I doing this? What will it be? How will I experiment around it? The preparation and the preemptive repair is about building yourself back up to a high level of capacity before you take on a new challenge. Most people are over-challenged, honestly, right now. They're freaking out and ragged around the edges.
Yeah. I was thinking about how so much of what we learn about, well, certainly how we eat, how we exercise starts at a very early age. I mean, we're exposed to, hot lunches in elementary school, recess that only lasts about 15 minutes, school mandates and school nurses that are pathologizing every sneeze and cough and suggesting medicines. So from a very early age here in the States, we are exposed to, well, I guess the norms. And so one of the things I was thinking about, and it's a little bit unfair. I'm asking people to pretend that they're parents, even if you're not. And how would you want to teach your children and put yourself in their shoes around how to embrace a way of life that's not about yesing everything or following everybody in a straight line. And, it's hard as a parent when your kid doesn't follow a straight line. At the same time, there's real joy to the exploration and the inquisitiveness of a curious child. So we all have to be more curious. I love that you use that word. I mean, there's a reason I call this program GynoCurious, because I don't pretend to have all the answers. I'm just kind of always asking again and again, well, why or who or how, and yeah, continually learning is just such an important part of the vitality that you speak about, even the resilience of understanding change is inevitable and perhaps even necessary for our continued growth. So I want to pivot a little bit. You coined a couple of phrases that I want us to explore. One is the pissed off body syndrome, and the second is the ape in the arcade syndrome. So let's start with the pissed off body syndrome. Can you tell us about what that is?
Yeah, and the two are totally related, so they're fun to pull out together. Pissed off body syndrome is my term for the wide array of signals our body sends us when it's not happy with the way that we're living. So a lot of the conventionally diagnosed diseases, things that have codes, in the medical system, are things that are inflammatory in nature. You've got this type of rash or that type of rash. You've got this type of headache or that type of headache. And the incredible range of options that the body has to tell us it's not happy, it's great. And most diagnoses are really descriptions of the symptoms you're experiencing. An example would be perioral dermatitis, which I suffered from in my 30s. A lot of women suffer from in their 30s. And peri means around. Dermal has to do with the skin. And dermatitis is, like you've got like a rash or an irritated set of skin. So around the mouth, rash is basically what perioral dermatitis is. Getting the diagnosis doesn't tell you why you have it, and it doesn't tell you how to undo it. For me, primary driver of that, as it is for many women of that age, is stress combined with lack of recovery, like sleep, and lack of the right nutrients to lower inflammation and help the body heal itself. So pissed off body syndrome might look like a rash. It might look like joint pain. It might look like brain fog. It might look like depression or anxiety. It might look like weight gain, digestive distress. But all of it is really a syndrome related to unhappy bodies, living in a world that pretty much makes all of our bodies unhappy. And that's why so much of the chronic illness, some people say up to 90% of the chronic illnesses that people suffer are in some way related to stress, or the fact that the stresses we're experiencing are not being supported by the way that we're living. We can't handle that level of stress because we have too much sugar and inflammation and other things. I have a list in my book and online, people can find it at my website, a little quiz called the Weird Symptom Checklist, where you go through and check off all of the things that you're experiencing. It's kind of like a multi-symptom questionnaire that they use in functional medicine physicians' offices, but this is much shorter and easier, a little bit less nuanced. But at the end of it, you take a look at how many things out of 42 you've clicked yes to. And a lot of people are getting scores like 22, 23, 36. They literally have almost all of the symptoms of pissed off body syndrome. And they have, 26 different diagnoses of different conditions. Pissed off body syndrome to me is just a really easy way of simplifying all of that diagnostic and pathologizing language and just simply saying, what am I doing that is not making my body happy? How am I living that is pissing my body off? And how can I remove the triggers of all of that anger and frustration that my body has by getting an agreement with my body, meeting its most basic needs, removing the things that are irritating it, and providing the inputs that can help it heal, that can support it in reclaiming its natural state of health. I'm a really big believer that the natural default state of our bodies is health. And given the right circumstances, most bodies will return to health. I'm right now working on a white paper, and actually I wrote the white paper. I'm working on an article about chronic disease reversal and what that really means, what it is not, and how people can achieve it, where it's being done well, where it's being successfully done inside of the VA system, inside of Cleveland Clinic. But it's so funny to me, almost all of the disease reversal programs, whether you're talking about arthritis or migraines or Alzheimer's, kind of a hot topic right now because there was just a piece in the New York Times about that, really follow very similar protocols. Removing the thing that is frustrating your body, giving it what it needs to repair, helping it to rebalance, helping to restore the microbiome, for example. And a lot of functional medicine physicians will say that many, up to 70 or 80% of their patients, get better following the same protocol, and then they don't actually need to do anything else. That's it. So the ape in the arcade, which is the second thing you talked about, to me describes the circumstances that produce pissed off body syndrome. And in my book, I have an illustration of an ape, a great ape. What would happen? The question is basically, if you took a great ape, like a gorilla, took him out of the jungle, and instead of putting him in a zoo where things are even approximately appropriate for an animal like that, you just stuck him in a video arcade and just set him free. Set that thing in there on its own with all the buzzing lights, all the bings and buzzers, this concession stand, give him an ATM card, provide a couple of machines that produce tokens and that dispense pain pills, and just see how he does for a period of time. That poor creature would fall apart in a matter of days or, max a couple of weeks. We'd be like, first of all, the people who care about the ethical treatment of animals would be like, you cannot do that. But we do that to ourselves. We basically have the DNA of an animal of that type, a primate, that has developed over 2.5 million years, living in natural environments with natural foods and natural cycles and natural circumstances that are supportive. Our DNA has developed in accordance with that way of life, hunter-gatherer, basically, existences. The environments that we find ourselves in now every day are more akin to that arcade. Overstimulating, electrified, technologized, processed food defaults, trying to figure out, how to deal with the money piece, and then being presented the idea of the pain pills is really a stand-in for our medical system, dealing with symptoms, suppressing the symptoms of our pain and our inflammation and our frustration and our suffering. And I think when we think about that, when we think about the fact that our headaches, our rashes, our weight problems, our depression and anxiety may be the result of the circumstances in which we find ourselves, instead of asking what is wrong with me, it could be like, what is wrong with the situation that is producing pissed off body syndrome in 90-some% of the population? I share in the very beginning of my book a statistic I found pretty horrifying that was done in some research. It was published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings, I think back in about 2016, that I don't think things have gotten better since then, that said that 97.3% of US adults were not following even the most basic healthy behaviors that would be required for them to be healthy and happy and stay healthy and happy for the long haul. You have to ask, is that because we're just stupid, weak-willed creatures? 97.3% of us are just lost causes? I don't think so. I think it's because we've made it so hard to be healthy and happy that only, a single-digit percentage of US adults has been able to pull it off in recent years or decades. And we have got to change the circumstances. We have to get out of the arcade, find a way of escaping or remodeling it so that we can live in it more successfully as a species and as a community.
Yeah, making it all right for someone to choose that lifestyle. I was so struck when you're talking about the pissed off body syndrome that it's, I was trained in the allopathic model, and the allopathic model is all about specialization. And I think that's evolved because for so long, nobody was willing to say, the hip bone was connected to the knee bone, or that what you ate affected the GI system. Like, people were not willing to see the mind, body, and spirit as this whole picture. It's slowly changing, but I can tell you there's, plenty of folks who are still very myopic. And the model is, someone comes in with a set of symptoms, you make a diagnosis, and then you give them medication. And that is the way it's done. And it's done over and over and over again. And as a patient in the system, it's really hard to fight that. I mean, I know, and I've spoken about this on GynoCurious before. So it's, it's really hard when you're not feeling well to say no to a physician. It's really hard to say to a physician, I don't agree with that. Can we talk about an alternative way of doing something? No, thank you. I want to try this and not that. I had a person come into my office the other day who was complaining of a rash, whole body rash, for a year. She was taking one medication. That medication was started a year ago. The number one side effect on this medication is rash and itching. She had been to her
Ooh.
doctor several times, talked about this medicine, which was being given for reasons that were not totally clear to me, and this rash. And I actually felt compassion for the physician. I was like,
Mhm.
what created an environment that kept her from asking this, what felt like a really straightforward question to me? I mean, it's
Mhm.
hard enough when you have a list of 10 medicines, is any of these giving a rash? But there was only
Yeah.
one. It just, the system is under such pressure. I think we're all living in between, two iron plates that are constantly coming closer and closer and closer, and the heat is more and more intense.
Yeah.
So I think that you would agree that part of this journey is compassion, not only for ourselves, but for the world around us, trying to
Absolutely.
figure out step by step with an acceptance that those steps might change in our lives daily and monthly and yearly. And that learning how to ask questions, learning how to say no is part, for me, is so much a preliminary part of this phenomenon. Which brings me to a conversation that I don't know if you want to talk about it, but I want to talk about the pandemic because
Oh,
I
sure.
think the pandemic was such for lack of a better word, an interesting, provocative time in the
Yeah.
world of medicine, the world of politics, kind of the world. And how do you contextualize it? How do you think about it vis-a-vis the work that you do?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, a fellow journalist today, about the sort of the background of the pandemic. And a lot of our zootropic diseases, the significant ones are mostly that, like having to do with animals being displaced from their natural habitats, moving into crowded areas where humans and animals interact, those diseases hopping. And in the meantime, the antibiotic use that we've been having in all of our agriculture for many years, creating antibiotic resistant bugs in our food system, within us, and so to me, you mentioned the two plates moving together. I think the fact that we have a medical system that has focused on symptom suppression and diagnostic followed by a treatment of the symptoms, not really helping people understand in any way, or doctors for that matter, understand the circumstances that produce health versus disease. The circumstances that produce health versus disease in people, in animals, in ecosystems, in the globe in general are actually very similar. There is a certain amount of, let's call it pollution or toxins, that are tolerable before things start going wrong. There is a certain necessity for clearing and detoxifying. There's a certain level of closeness that we can have living in large groups of people before overcrowding and disease becomes a problem, sanitation is an issue. And this is true at every level of our existence. It's true in the microcosm of a given cell, like the cell membrane being healthy or not healthy, stuff being inside that cell that does or doesn't belong there, and the immune system being able to access it, and so on. I think if we could learn about the conditions that produce health, we would be much less likely to be encountering pandemics of all kinds, and we would argue less about the appropriate treatment of them. I understand. Again, I am an advocate for body autonomy. I'm an advocate for people having choices about what types of medical care they prefer, what things they do or don't want put into their bodies. And at the same time, I think that we are living in a culture that has failed to educate people about the impacts of the way that we are living and the likelihood of these kinds of diseases spreading inside of communities in ways that are absolutely catastrophic and needlessly fatal for a whole bunch of folks. My personal opinion is that the amount of misinformation that was circulating at the time of the outset of the pandemic landed in an environment of such polarized media and such miseducation and lack of education, even. We don't understand enough about how our bodies work, how our environments work, how the world works. And that, to be crude about it, our ignorance, our I won't say stupidity, but leaves us very vulnerable to having no idea how to make informed decisions about our health. Then people get so reactive. I think honestly, the inflammatory mindsets that people have too are partially reflective of messed up microbiomes and messed up blood-brain barriers. And so I just think it is a perfect storm. I think we'll see many, many more pandemics before we start getting smarter about it as a group. But that doesn't mean that individually we cannot educate ourselves more about the harmonics and delicate systems within the body and the conditions that produce health within us individually and collectively and globally. I don't mean to skirt if there was a question behind there in it, but I definitely think the most autonomous and revolutionary thing you can do is to be willing to think for yourself enough to learn. I'm never going to be a virologist. I don't know that I want to listen to a bunch of people arguing about that as the primary conditions for my health. Starts with you doing the things you need to do to be healthy for you, and then you making informed decisions, ideally in a non-inflamed state. I think if you're fighting all the time, it's probably not healthy for you no matter what you're doing.
Touche.
Yeah.
Touche. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, it's a question that is far reaching, and this is not necessarily the time that we can, we're going to talk about it. I just wanted a kind of an initial response because I do think that I totally agree with you. I think we're going to see many more pandemics ahead of us. I think we've created an unhealthy world, as you've described, and that it is clearly about our response to identifying the unhealthy aspects of our world and trying to correct those things on a global way, but also on a very self-limited way, what we can do as individuals to promote well-being and understanding. You mentioned the microbiome. I think it is a perfect if almost a metaphor for, we knew nothing about the microbiome. Well, no one was willing to talk about the microbiome, even 5-10 years ago. Now it's all over the news, but still people are shocked to hear, we have a microbiome in the placenta, in the brain, that the only way we exist is by having this incredibly complex ecosystem of bacteria and yeast all over us. And so
can I say something about that?
Yes, please.
One of the other things we haven't really talked about is the importance of scientific education and of people being educated from an early age to understand the limits of science that we have now. Science is going to continue to change and evolve.
Right.
But I remember taking my first cell biology class, and it was later in my education. It was like high school because my grade school didn't offer those classes. The first time I looked under a microscope and saw one of my own human cells and the complexity and the beauty of all of the different mechanisms and technologies and interactions going on inside that cell. My mind was blown, Amy. And I never became a scientist. I don't have a science brain, but I am so grateful to scientists who practice scientific method and who are continuing to change their minds about something that they thought they knew yesterday and changed it today. Because that is how science is supposed to work. It isn't the end of the line at any given moment, but to shut out science, to think that we don't need science practicing their craft, we don't need scientists learning and growing and experimenting, I think is a mistake that we make at our own peril. There's a lot that we've learned and we will continue to learn at exponentially great rates, thanks or maybe due to, well, should say AI. We're living in a really interesting time. I don't pretend to know the future, but I do know the conditions that produce health and happiness in human beings and animals and communities. And I'm staying focused on what I can do in that complex, already very complex environment to take care of myself, even in the face of really significant barriers, deviating as much as I need to continue to stay conscious enough to make healthy choices today, tomorrow, the next day, as far as ahead as I can see. And I really want to help other people do that too. I really appreciate your work broadcasting on topics like this because they're not the kind that often break through. These kind of sprawling liberal arts style conversations rarely happen anymore. And I think connecting these dots, history, science, philosophy, personal development, gynecology, and brain science, let's talk more about these interconnected systems. I agree with you. The medical education, unfortunately, that most allopathic physicians have received is just limited by its very nature. They're good at acute stuff, less great at anything having to do with chronic or systemic problems because of it.
Yeah.
And we're systems.
Yeah,
we are very complex systems.
We are like the mycelia. We are so interconnected, and unfortunately, allopathic education is very much about each branch of the fungi or each tree being separate from the other, and it's a terrible disservice.
Doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't work that way, and we know it. But the educational system is moving at a glacial pace.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, we are coming to an end, and I want Pilar, would you please tell people how they can learn more about you? You know, all of your Twitter and all this other stuff. How do they find you?
Happily. Well, I'm on a bunch of social media places, but the place I would love for people to encounter my work, obviously my book, my website, healthydeviant.com, is a great landing place to discover my programs. I give talks at lots of different places. I have a membership program. I've got free classes, podcasts, all of that stuff. About a year ago, I started a Substack called Healthy Deviant Digest, and that is also a really great place for people to start familiarizing themselves with my ideas and work, and also accessing tools and resources that I only share there or that I share with my subscribers there. If you sign up for that, you get free weekly Healthy Deviant kind of news drops or digest drops, and an option too for people who want to become paid subscribers to get extra goodies and special invitations to things like my Healthy Deviant Day Camp and so on.
Great.
Most important to me is that people know how they like to learn, whether it's auditory or reading or experiential, and find the thing that works for them.
Great, great. May we all be deviants. I like this idea.
Yeah.
So the last question I always like to ask my guests is what gives them pleasure? It's something that women have not spoken enough about over the course of centuries. And if they did utter what gave them pleasure, it was often at great risk. But we are here today to talk about what would you say gives you pleasure?
Oh, first of all, I love that question too. I wrote a feature article called A Real Pleasure many years ago that looked at the scientific advantages of pleasure in all people's lives. But I agree with you, women's pleasure is notoriously underconsidered and under-leveraged in this world as a force for good. When I think about pleasure, I think about walking across the fields that are up top, about a 10-minute walk up a hill. When I get to the top of the hill and the view opens up and I can see sky and clouds, I feel the sensation of the breeze on my skin. I smell wild things and plants and animals. I have cows up there. I feel the ground under my feet. I feel centered. I see my dog. I see members of my family up there sometimes. It's my happy place. And to me, the combination of the sensory rich environment, the feeling of nature being such a healing space, me being free to move under my own steam across the globe like that, is just the ultimate pleasure for me. And it is when I feel my body become more enlivened and seduced by the experience of just being alive. And that is just a glorious feeling.
The seduction of life. I love it. I love it. Well, I wish for you many travels up that hill, and may the breeze always be blowing all those wonderful scents your way. Thank you, Pilar, for joining me. I'm so, so grateful. And thank you to my co-producers Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud, and to David Hoffman, my editor, and to Matthew, who's here in the wonderful recording studio of the Epicurean today with me. Until the next episode, please be well. Listen to your instincts and intuitions. They are the greatest of teachers, not to be ignored. And I want to remind listeners that this podcast is for general informational purposes only, does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and that no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The information on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.